Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to show you how to paint some Russian Line Infantry using the Prussian Infantry Brigade box set for Warlord's Black Powder Waterloo campaign. They're a little bit under 15 millimeter. We would typically paint them up to look like this, but without any conversion, just using paint, we're going to get some Russian Line Infantry, and I'll show you how to do that today. First step, we need to clean the plastic sprues. That's going to get the mold release off there. So using an appropriately sized container, we're just going to put a little bit of dishwashing soap in there and some warm water. It doesn't need to be too hot. We're going to get some suds going there, and then we're just going to dunk our plastic sprue in. I'm going to wash that off thoroughly, and you can let it sit for a while. We want to make sure we get all the soapy residue off too, so I'm rinsing it thoroughly and then leave that to dry for a while. And next we're going to use a pair of really sharp plastic nippers, and we're just going to cut out the unit that we want to paint. I also have a sharp X-Acto blade. We're going to use that to clean up any mold lines or anything we need to repair. I'm going to cut off the nibs at the bottom here. These are used to mount these to the bases that are supplied by Warlord games, but I use a different basing system. Also, I'm going to snip here, and I paint in groups of 5. If you are going to use the normal bases and groups of 10, this is totally optional. This is how I base mine. Next, we're going to prime the figures. I like to use Tamiya's Fine Surface Primer. And it's important that we use white because the white primer is actually going to serve as a base for everything we do on this. So you can use whatever primer you prefer. But we're getting 2 nice light coats. We shook the can up and we're keeping the can moving. We're not trying to lose any of the detail in the model. And once those are dried, we should have a nicely primed figure ready for paint. The first layer we're going to put down on the figure is a shade, this Citadel Nuln Oil. If you prefer Army Painter, I think Dark Tone will give you the same results. And just using an old calligraphy brush, I'm putting a nice thin wash over the entire figure. This is going to sink into the recesses, and we want to leave it to dry thoroughly. But when it has dried, it's going to help us pick out the details on the model for our future layers of paint. So once that wash is dried, we're going to come in with the Citadel Contrast Color Black Templar, or again, if you prefer Army Painter, you can use Grim Black. And we're going to use that to paint in all the black areas, so the boots, the shako, and on the back we have the sword scabbard, and the cartridge box, and the backpack. For paint application, I just use these cheap synthetic brushes by Princeton. They're essentially disposable. This one here is a 20-0 round. And the downside of such a fine brush is that it doesn't hold much color in the bristles. A larger brush you're going to find can come to just as fine of a point and can hold a lot more color. But these are the ones I use. I don't mind having to go back to the pot to pick up more color more frequently. When you're painting these models up as Prussians, the gaiters and the boots are going to be the same color. That's going to be black. But for the Russians, we're just painting the tip of the boot that sticks out from beneath the gaiter. We want to keep the gaiter white. In fact, that's why we primed these with white primer, because that primer plus the Nuln Oil wash is basically going to give us 99% of our pants and gaiters. We're just going to leave them with a little bit of touch-ups. But you also notice I'm painting kind of tidy. I'm being methodical. I'm making sure I don't get any splash up on the gaiters. It's okay if we get it on the base. We're going to cover the base with a brown later. But you might see some YouTube painting tutorials where they're a little more slapdash, and they're like, they'll come back in, and I just prefer to take my time and not have to pull back colors and go over stuff I painted. Especially with these contrast paints, they can reactivate, so it's not just as simple as pulling out one of your previous colors and touching it up. I'm lazy too. If I don't ever have to touch anything up, I would prefer that. So I go a little slow and a little methodical in these stages. You'll also notice I'm holding the figure. I'm wearing nitrile gloves and holding the figure. Sometimes you'll see other mini painters will mount their figures to like a cork, like a wine bottle cork, or some other holder. And I do that too, but for these ones, I like to be able to manipulate the figure. The glove that I'm wearing is specifically to keep the oil from my skin off of the model. Your oil and mold release are the two things that are going to affect paint adhesion the most. So that is why I wear the gloves. And and I just like to be able to hold and manipulate the figure as I paint so I can get the right angle. It's particularly important on these small guys. And I'm happy with where the boots are now, so I'm gonna move up to start painting the shako. Because we washed the figure first, it's also easier to sort of see the lines where I need to keep the paint in. I'm also using a magnifying lamp that's up close to my face, so I have a source of light and about essentially a 6-inch magnifying glass in front of my face. That really helps with figures at this scale. You'll hear a lot of talk online of people saying, oh, I like the way Warlord's epics look, but I could never paint something that small. And I really don't think that's the case at all. In fact, I think they've gone to great lengths to ensure that these are actually extremely paintable figures. They're some of the most paintable figures I've ever used because they have like the details will be popped out. It's actually, I find it easier to paint 5 15mm figures than one 28mm figure. It takes about the same amount of time, and then you have 5 times the number of guys to put on the board. The old school like metal 15mm models, yes, those were difficult to paint, but I actually enjoy the process of painting these ones. You'll notice here I'm leaving the scabbard tip bare. That's because we're going to come back in with brass and give this a brass tip. Now we've finished the scabbards and the cartridge boxes, so we're going to move on to painting the backpack. On the Prussians, this would be like a leather brown color, but for the Russians, we're going to paint this black. All right, next we're going to paint this roll. This is the great coat. And for that, we're going to use Army Speed Paint Gravelord Gray. This is just going to give it a little bit darker gray than the Nuln stain that we already have on there. I've also seen artwork that shows this as a little bit more of a brown color. I'm using Gravelord Gray, but yeah, whatever looks good to you. On the Prussians, this part right at the top here is going to be painted brown. It's actually like a leather tube that you would button over your roll to keep it in that form. I don't think the Russians use that. It's on the model because we're painting Prussian models, but we're painting them as Russians. So I'm just going to paint the gray right over that, and we're going to ignore it. We're going to come back in later at a later stage with a gray highlight, like a lighter gray. But for now, we're just getting that tone in. All right, the next color we're going to put on is the green for the jacket here. There's not a whole lot of green showing, but this is the main differentiator between, the Russian and the Prussian uniforms. And for that, we're going to be using Citadel Contrast Carandra's green. I'm not even going to try and get in this crack here. I'm just going to let the shadow do its job. I'm not going to attempt that. We are going to come back over this model with a opaque white to highlight the crossbody strap. So if we get a little bit of spillage on the crossbody strap, it's not that big a deal. This is one case where we are going to be highlighting that anyway. And you may be thinking, wow, this is kind of under the camera, under the lights, this looks like a pretty bright green. And you're right, but I also think at smaller scales, it's important to paint them at least one step brighter than you really think. When we're viewing these on the tabletop at like a 3-foot distance, you're gonna be glad that it was this bright of a green, because that's how you're gonna be able to differentiate these figures. And since we're using contrast, we want to let contrast do its magic. So I'm just getting a little extra pooled here in the crack between these figures to let it do its magic. These tails on the figure, we're going to leave. We're going to come back in later with red. These are the turnbacks, so we're gonna paint these red later. And there we go. Not a whole lot of green, but that's it. Next, we're going to be painting this musette bag or haversack, whatever you want to call it. And for that, we're going to be using Pallid Bone by Army Painter. We will be coming back in later and hitting the tops of these with a highlight, but we just want to get the base coat in. Now we're going to paint the stocks of the musket, and for that we're going to be using Citadel Contrast Gore Grunta fur. Now I'm being careful not to paint over the hand that's holding the musket, because we're also going to be using a contrast paint on this, so we want to make sure we keep this clean so that contrast can do its magic. It's okay if we paint over the like the lock on the musket, because we're gonna be painting that later with an opaque silver. So it's fine if we paint over that. Also, while I've got the Gore Grunta fur out, I'm going to use it to paint at least one of the hair on the. I'm just going to pick a random figure and paint his hair in. Let's go ahead and use some other browns to paint the rest of the hair on the figures. And for that, I'm going to use a Vallejo Express Color Wasteland Brown. I also have Wildwood and Snakebite Leather those are contrast paints by Citadel. And yeah, we're just going to use those to finish off painting the hair. Now that we've got a variety of hair color in, we're going to paint the skin tone. And for that, we're going to be using a Citadel Contrast Color Gilliman Flesh. If you prefer speed paint, you could use Crusader Skin. Or if you have both and you're feeling spicy, you could, yeah, alternate them. These Caucasian skin tones work best on a white prime. In later paint tutorials, I might be painting over a gray primer, and in that case I would probably lay down an opaque white first on the skin areas. It gives contrast, lets it do its thing. Next, we're going to be putting in a base coat of silver color on the bayonet, the tin on the backpack. You could also put a little touch here on the scabbard holder, but I'm not going to do that. So we're getting all the silvery base coats, and for that we're going to be using model color oily steel by Vallejo. Here I'm painting in the line of the musket barrel. Now we're going to paint red, so that'll be these cuffs, the epaulette. If you're really confident in your brush skills, you might also be able to get some red up in the collar, but I don't even mess with that. So the paint we're going to be using is ball red. That's a Citadel contrast color. And I forgot those little turnbacks in the back, so I'm gonna come back in with that red and get these tails here. Next, we're going to do white. So that's going to be these braids on the shako, the pom-pom, the straps on the body. We're also going to dilute that white and give a little highlight on the trousers and gaiters. There's also a strap here on the back, on the backpack. And for this, we're going to be using model color Off-White by Vallejo. It's a nice white without being unnaturally bright. Most of the times I'm using the color straight out of the bottle at the consistency it comes at. That's because for the most part we're doing a single layer of contrast with then a single layer highlight on top of it. But for this, we are actually going to want to water this down. So we're going to get more of like a milky consistency. And we're going to use that milky consistency white to just highlight areas where we think light would be hitting the trousers and the gaiters. I did do a pretty solid white highlight right at the edge of the gaiter, just to give an extra highlight right before the boot black starts. And while we've got that thinned out milky white, we're also going to add a dash of gray. This gray, watered down with some white, is going to give us the highlight gray that we want for the top of the roll. Again, we're just thinking about where light's going to be hitting this roll, and we're going to be dropping in highlights on it. Now, of course, I was so excited to start working on highlights that I forgot the most important part. For the pure white, it would be this the braid here. So that's going to be the braid, the pom-pom, and the tassel hanging off the side. So we're gonna come back and get those. This is one of the trickiest things to paint because it's freehand. There's no detail sculpted in, but it's also the one of the things that really differentiates the Russian troops from the Prussian model that we're using. So we're going to take our time. We can break up painting the hoop, the braid hoop. We can do that in two parts and then join them in the middle. Or if you have a steady hand, you could probably do that in one swoop. I usually end up doing it in two, and we can come back in with black and clean this up if we make any mistakes or we get a little wibbly. But, for the most part, if you can do it in one steady swoop, that would be the best. Here I'm dotting white on for the pom-pom. And later we'll come back in and put a little black dot in it. But, yeah, we're just getting the pom-pom in. We're going to do brass next. So that'll be the fittings on the musket, the cap and pommel of the scabbard and the sword. It'll also be these insignia on the cartridge box, and if there's another insignia on the front of the shako. Paint we're going to be using for this is Brass by Vallejo Model Color. I am also using some reference art so that I understand what the shape of the insignia on the cartridge box is going to be. Even with the reference, while I was editing this video, I realized I accidentally painted the cartridge boxes as if they were Grenadier Company, not Musketeer. But it's an easy fix. The Musketeer one is just a little more simplified insignia. Once I've got the brass painted and it's dried, I'm gonna bring back the contrast black Templar, and we're just gonna use that to sort of fill in the space in the pommel, the sword handle. I'm also gonna bring back the Nuln Oil, the shade, and we're going to use that to wash the detail that's on the scabbard holder, but we're also going to drop a little bit of Nuln Oil in anywhere we want to heighten the shadows. We're going to look at the model all over and see where it needs any extra additional shadow. Next, we're going to highlight the skin tones. I use these Caucasian bright flesh tones made by Vic Hobby from Japan. They come out of the bottle very liquid. We're going to focus here on the chin, the nose, any highlights on the hands that we might need. I'm sorry about the focus here. I accidentally bumped the autofocus. But the contrast did a pretty good job here, so we don't need very many highlights. This is more important if we're working on a contrast that is over a gray primer usually, but since we used white primer, the contrast did a pretty good job on its own. We're just going to hit with a few highlights. And while I was painting the faces, I realized I completely forgot the chin strap, so we're going to bring the brass back out again and get that chin strap painted. We're going to highlight the steel areas now, and for that we're going to be using this paint by Vallejo. It's part of their Model Air metallic line called Steel. And we're just going to be hitting the edges, highlighting the stuff that we've already base coated with the oily steel. You could also hit the very tops of the firing mechanism, the locks on the muskets. Now I'm going to use a pen to drop in some dots and line some areas. I'm using this Neopico Line 3 from Deleter. This is a very fine tip pen, 003. I'm going to dot the palm, but pens are also useful for defining areas. Here on these Highlanders, I used the pen to make a definition between certain areas. Drop in shadows. On this sculpt, on the Prussian infantry sculpt, I don't think it's really necessary, but if there's anywhere you feel that you could stand to have some definition between colors, go ahead and drop a line in there. For the next step, I'm going to add some highlights over the contrast color areas. And for that, I'm going to be using 3 different paints from Vallejo Model Color. It's going to be Buff, Intermediate Green, and London Gray. We just need a little dot of each of those. For the buff color, I'm just going to do a little highlight on this, the haversack, the musette bag. Now I've got the intermediate green out, and again, I'm just going to do a little highlight where I think, the brightest part of the green jacket would be, where we're hitting it with light. And the London gray, I'm going to use to sort of edge highlight any of the black areas. So along the hard edge of like the shako and possibly the backpack scabbard. I like to get a highlight right along the tip of the visor on the shako as well. Now we're going to get back out a wash that we used previously, and we're going to wash the base brown. I'm going to use that Express Color by Vallejo, the Wasteland Brown. The way I base my models, I'm going to add static grass over this later, but it's good to have a brown base coat, just the dirt beneath the grass. And there we go. We've now expanded the forces that we can get into our epic Napoleonic battles. Just a simple paint conversion going from the Prussian line to Russian line. The only tricky part was that freehanding that tassel, that braid. Stick around for the next tutorial. I'm going to show you how to paint up some Pavlovsky Grenadiers, some Russian Grenadiers. Thank you.